Hello and welcome to this training course. I am so glad you have signed up for our first free pathway session, Reframing Child Development. What if it is a difference rather than a delay? This session marks the beginning of hopefully many future training opportunities. And I just wanted to start with an introduction to myself. So, my name is Kerry Murphy, and I am the founder of Diverse Pathways for Early Childhood and the project lead for this work, which is currently a passion project of lots of different early educators in different roles, including parents and carers. I'm an early childhood specialist with over 20 years' experience, focusing specifically on educational inclusion for children with developmental differences and disabilities. And I wear many hats in my role. I'm an author, lecturer, consultant, trainer, and I am also autistic and ADHD, and I draw on lived experience frameworks in my work. I'm also currently completing a doctorate exploring how neurodiversity-affirming training can disrupt neuronormativity in early childhood settings, specifically focusing on the pathologization of play and child development. And that has been a massive springboard for this particular project. So, this work has been developed collectively, and the diverse and divergent pathways for early childhood has been developed by a group that we are currently referring to as the Neurodiversity-affirming Early Childhood Collective, which is a bit of a tongue twister, but it is a group of people who are passionate about dismantling the current SEND system and reimagining inclusive education for our neurodivergent and disabled children. Our collective includes early childhood educators, specialists, therapists, parents, carers, teachers, and those with lived experience of neurodivergence and disabilities. And we essentially came together to create and share new knowledge around neurodiversity affirming practices, specifically in early childhood, and begin to map out all the equally valid ways that children play, grow, develop, sense, feel, communicate, and connect. Our main aim as a group is to disrupt the idea that typical and non disabled development is the best or right way to develop, because that is not a reality in our early childhood settings. And instead, we want to embrace all the unique developmental pathways children will take, whilst ensuring that we have early attunement and early intervention where relevant, along with sensitive scaffolding and support. The collective is still very much in its early infancy, and if you are interested in joining or being involved, whether you bring lived experience, professional expertise, you're curious, or just have feedback, we would really be keen to hear from you. And you can reach us at queries@diversepathways.org.uk. Before we begin, it's also worth making a quick note on this work. The contents of this resource must not be copied, duplicated, or repurposed without permission, although we do want people to use it. We also ask that it is not taken out of context. If you have questions or queries, please do contact us directly. If you utilise any of the materials, please do just credit and cite primary and secondary sources within the document. And if you wish to embrace and reference diverse pathways for early childhood in your own work, research, or practice, you can use the citations that we have provided for you on this particular slide. So just to say thank you for being here and for your commitment to doing things differently in our education system. We do not want our children to fit into systems, particularly systems that were not necessarily designed with them in mind. And we want systems that stretch and grow to adapt to and accommodate all the different ways our children develop. So let's begin with the training. Okay, so what can you expect from this session? I am going to begin with a rationale and description for both the diverse pathways for early childhood and the divergent pathway, and explaining why this work matters and what it offers that current approaches often overlook. You will be introduced to the foundations of neurodiversity affirming practice and what this could look like in action across our early childhood settings. So whether you're in a school, you're a childminder, or in a private, voluntary, or independent setting. We will also explore a powerful reframe of child development, moving beyond this idea of typical milestones to recognize the wide range of valid developmental pathways children might follow. I'll share insights into why some children are seen as behind or delayed or deficit, when in reality they may simply be on a different developmental path. And it is a path that understands or deserves understanding and support rather than correction, intervention, and normalization. I'm also going to be giving a sneak peek preview of the divergent pathway of development for autism, specifically focusing on autistic play patterns, and that launches this October. And I will talk to you about what is coming next with our diverse pathways for early childhood and how you can be a part of it. And finally, you will receive, on top of this free training, a free resource that you can start using straight away in your practice. So let's start with some terminology related to this project. We are introducing new terminologies, but terms that will hopefully be helpful and more affirming of our children who have developmental differences and disabilities. So, diverse pathways is the umbrella term for our work, and it is grounded in the understanding that every child follows a unique developmental pathway. You might compare this to the early years foundation stage framework's principle of the unique child. And our unique developmental pathways are shaped by many different things: our biology, the environments and lived experiences that we have, the relationships and connections. And as educators, parents, carers, and specialists, this perspective invites us to essentially honour all developmental experiences, not just ones that fit in with typical and non-disabled development. Every path is meaningful and every path is valid. And one of the first areas of focus for us has been to create a divergent pathway. And the divergent pathway is essentially our kind of attempt to explore autistic child development through a neurodiversity affirming perspective, because currently within early education, generally, if you are autistic, you are viewed or positioned through a lens of special educational needs and through a deficit lens. Even as individuals, as an educator, if you don't think that way, the system is designed for us to view autistic development as something wrong that needs to be fixed or corrected. We have started with autism, but the diverse pathways is about creating a framework for many different developmental experiences. And we have begun with this particular neurotype because we know that autism is prevalent within our early childhood settings. This pathway, this divergent pathway, is not designed to be prescriptive. We are not saying that all children will develop in this way, and we know there will be crossover with other developmental experiences. But right now we have nothing. And so we need something that really frames autism through a child development lens. It is also not a checklist. It is not something that needs to be highlighted or ticked off or a new set of expectations. We are drawing upon research that is already out there about how autistic children develop, but from a neutral and also strengths-driven perspective. So it is a framework rooted in lived experience and supported by emerging neurodiversity affirming research. So we have drawn upon lots of autistic-led research and research that's been carried out by autistic people. And it offers you a different lens, one that moves away from deficit-based models and towards a deeper understanding of how our autistic children engage, how they play, how they sense, how they feel, communicate, and grow. While this particular pathway is centered on autism, we very much hope that the broader approach of recognizing and valuing difference can be applied across a range of developmental experiences. So you might pick this up and think this would be really useful for children with ADHD, who are dyslexic, who are Down syndrome. It's about expanding and diversifying our understanding of child development. So this is about making space for many ways of being. It's not about limiting the ways in which we perceive child development in our young children, and it's about doing that collectively as well. And it is probably worth saying before we move on to defining neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practice that the divergent pathway for autism is not about denying that autistic children will have needs. They might have delays, they might have challenges, but we believe that that needs to be understood holistically. So we need to understand the strengths, we need to understand the traits, we need to understand how children do things differently in order to then support those areas of need. And we have included that in the divergent pathway. We are very aware that there can sometimes be a tendency to centre strengths-led or celebratory approaches, which can undermine the areas in which children might be having very real difficulties, and we are not denying that in this project. Okay, so for this training, I am going to give a brief definition of neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practice, and you are also going to get a bonus definition, which is neuronormativity. Do not panic if these are terms that are relatively new to you or feel quite academic in tone. They are hopefully going to be well defined by myself and will resonate with perhaps what you are observing and seeing in your everyday practice in early childhood. And it's really important to say that as we define these different terms, neurodiversity affirming practice is a resistance approach to the existence of neuronormativity within our education system. And so we need to understand both so that we have ownership and rationale for why you might then go on to decide to pursue neurodiversity affirming practice. So let's have a go of breaking down those terminologies. For the purpose of this particular pathway session, I am going to provide a relatively generic and straightforward definition of neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practice. But it is really important to say that neurodiversity as a paradigm, as a framework, has a really rich and intricate and advocacy based history. It is a term that was collectively coined by neurodivergent people, specifically autistic advocates, to recognize the neurological diversity of humans. And so the definition that I'm going to give today is a kind of roundup definition for the purpose of this pathway session. But there is other training that we are going to offer going forward where we delve a little bit deeper into the social justice elements of neurodiversity. But there are also so many advocates out there that can give you a more historical context if you are interested in that. And it is important to know where our terminologies come from and what they are rooted in. So for the purpose of this pathway session, I am going to describe both of these terms and then go on to explain neuronormativity. But in its most simplest terms, neurodiversity quite literally refers to all human differences. So when we think about neurodiversity, we're thinking about everyone. It is all of humanity. And it is that recognition that we are different from one another. And those differences are shaped by lots of different factors. So our biology, our genetics, our lived experiences, our environments. And neurodiversity as a concept is looking at the inevitability of that, the biological fact that that's going to happen. But what is really, really important when we think about neurodiversity is the recognition, it's a neutral term, and recognition that there is no inherently superior or inferior way of being. So if, for example, you are dyslexic, if you are autistic, if you are neurotypical conforming, there is no better or worse type of human. There is no better or worse type of being. There is no less than or diminished state if you have an experience that diverges from what is considered normal. You just are as you are. So neurodiversity is that recognition of human differences, and it is relevant in early childhood because we want children to develop a holistic and neutral understanding of themselves. So if, for example, a child is on a diagnostic pathway or has developmental differences within their early childhood experiences, we really need to think about what messages are they receiving about the ways in which they differ from their peers, and actually how are we teaching all children about the value of differences, essentially. When we think of neurodiversity affirming practice, what we are then thinking about is how do we then advocate for the recognition of human differences, and how do we ensure that all children have a good quality of life where their well-being is centered and they experience developmentally meaningful outcomes. So neurodiversity affirming practice is rejecting the idea that if a child has a difference and or a disability, that we should be solely focused on fixing and curing and normalizing and intervening with that child. Actually, we are looking at what is compatible with your lived experience. People often refer to neurodiversity affirming practice as akin to biodiversity and this recognition that we have to think about the conditions that our children exist in. And rather than situating everything as a problem or a failing or a fault or a deficit of the child, we actually really think about the environmental conditions of that child and whether those conditions help a child to grow, to thrive, to grow into themselves, or whether they're in conditions that feel entirely incompatible and adverse for their experiences. So when we think about neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practice, we are recognizing inevitability, the biological fact, and we are embracing that actually difference is a good thing, and difference is actually what unites us as people, because we are all different from one another. So hopefully that feels relatively clear. If you're interested in neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming practice, we have a course that is currently available on the website as well, diversepathways.org. So the reason that we need neurodiversity affirming practice in early childhood is because of this issue of neuronormativity. This is a term that will likely be relatively new to those working in early education, and there are other terms that we need to be aware of in terms of the discrimination that can show up towards neurodivergent and disabled children in early years. But neuronormativity describes why we have decided specifically to develop the diverse pathways for early childhood, and this definition will hopefully help you to see why it's so important that we embrace neurodiversity. So neuronormativity is the belief that there is a correct, right, or superior way to function as a human. And this begins in early childhood. It is based on a relatively narrow set of social norms, expectations, and behaviors that humans must meet to be seen as normal. Even though normal is a myth, there is no such thing as normal. It is a social construct, and it is okay that we are all quite weird. It shapes how we are allowed and permitted to think, feel, process, sense, play, learn, pay attention, regulate, behave, and interact. So for children and adults, we're often under these pressures to pass as normal, to fit in, to behave in ways that we would consider socially acceptable, even though inherently we might have traits that diverge from that. To give you a really simple example that spans childhood and adulthood, self-stimulatory behaviors, which are often more salient, more obvious in those who are neurodivergent, such as being autistic. So you might have somebody that likes to flap their hands, and this might be a way in which they regulate, a way in which they communicate, a way in which they show they are being playful, a way in which they're expressing joy. Historically, if you engage in any form of self-stimulatory behavior, it would have been viewed as an abnormal behavior that needs to be stopped, and you would be trained out of through intervention. And that still happens today as well. And what we're now increasingly understanding is that stimming is a really important part of a lot of neurodivergent people's identity. And I would probably argue also part of neurotypical conforming identity as well. But we've been told that it's weird to hand flap, or it's weird to have vocal stims, or it's weird to use your body in a self-stimulatory way in public spaces. And so what we see is then this doesn't pass as normal, you need to stop doing it. And that is just one of very many examples. What then happens via neuronormativity is humans are categorized according to their capacity to conform or not. And so more crudely, we might see people described as normal versus abnormal. In the education system, we have typically developing children versus children who are identified as having special educational needs, which we know has become a really ineffective term to describe those children who are different, and it is very imprecise. There is lots of variation in how we present. But what this creates is segregation of children into experiences of privilege. So if you can pass for normal, you're going to fit in society and you're going to have greater opportunities to engage in that society, or marginalization. If you are deemed not to fit in, if you don't pass as normal, you will experience othering, exclusion, judgment, intervention. And again, this impacts across the lifespan. So how does neuronormativity show up in the early years? One key way is through developmentalism. And developmentalism is an approach that assumes that human development, including child development, follows a fixed linear path. So for example, children all essentially meeting the same milestones, that children will progress through the same stages, usually in the same order at roughly the same time. And whilst we know that EYFS does claim to embrace a unique child at which children would develop at different rates and paces, the fact that we have early learning goals, the fact that we measure a good level of development, the fact that we focus on school readiness contradicts that very idea. So let's take a closer look at developmentalism, why it underpins what we are doing at Diverse Pathways for Early Childhood, and what we can do about it, most importantly. And just to say before we go into this, having aspirations, having goals, having expectations, high expectations for all your children is absolutely essential in our early education system. But if those goals, if those expectations, if those aspirations only centre typical and non-disabled development, children are going to fail before they've even begun that experience. So, developmentalism, it is a way of understanding child development that assumes it essentially happens in a straight line. So, it's fixed, it's usually stage by stage. So, you might think of Piaget, you might think of Parton's stages of play, and it relies heavily on an ages and stages framework, which a lot of us historically have always found to be really positive. But actually, it still suggests that every child is following this universal developmental pathway. And when you have that type of pathway, it leads to you ranking, sorting, and classifying children based at what they can do on certain ages, irrespective of their developmental pathway. This approach assumes that growth will always follow the same sequential order for everyone. And if you are not following that sequential order, that you should essentially bend yourself out of shape to be able to fit in. So when a child develops differently, that difference is then seen as a problem, something abnormal that needs fixing. So, for example, you might see intervention programs that are about correcting children. You might have practices within your own early childhood setting where you are essentially getting children to follow the same types of rules or expectations so that everybody fits in. And it essentially leads to approaches that are more about getting the child to fit the expected mold, and it can result in the othering of children. So special educational needs is an othering term. It separates those children out from your normal children and treats them as separate or less than, despite the fact that the system itself hasn't been described or developed in a way that accounts for those variations. And in reality, development is far more varied. These are the realities that you will be facing every day. Development is much more flexible and diverse than developmentalism allows. So while we can absolutely acknowledge and thank the pioneers for their work, we can also recognize that they do not describe or suit the children of today. And this goes some way to explaining why I often feel resistant about this idea that we can fix the SEND system or we can fix the education system. They are intentionally designed this way. So we have to reimagine something different, because developmentalism and neuronormativity extends to the policies and frameworks that shape how we observe, assess, and plan for our children's experiences in the early years. So, for example, our traditional child development guidance is often built around expected milestones, and it is presented in a neat linear order, even though we're then encouraged to embrace the unique child. It requires us to look at children as though they're all moving through a step-by-step process through the same sequence. It doesn't really allow for us to recognize those vast variations that we see in development. And what developmentalism does is it creates generalizations or sweeping statements about what children should be able to do by a certain age. So a really big area of focus is this idea that children are assessed in their attention skills based on how still they are, if they've got looking eyes, if they've got quiet hands and listening ears. This idea that attention as a developmental experience will look the same for every child. And it puts us as early educators in constant contradictions, because we're trying to be child-led, we're trying to be play-based, we're trying to embrace uniqueness, but ultimately we've got to get these children ready for compliance in time for school. So on the one hand, developmentalism promotes a universal pathway, and on the other hand, we're all told that children are unique and develop at their own rate. And when you are in that situation, what then often happens is you are told to use universal strategies for all children, and that that's going to secure success, and that that's what inclusion is. Again, that's not a reality. We need different things for different children, and we need to expand and diversify our kind of toolkits of inclusion. So in England, this uniqueness also seems to expire. I've mentioned this several times in this session already, but it seems to expire the moment that we need to measure our children at the end of the early years foundation stage. And if we put this into reality at an age as young as 4, We are stating whether a child has reached a good level of development ready for school, but not necessarily taking into account their developmental pathway. And so the question that we're asking at Diverse Pathways for Early Childhood is, why are children only unique up until a certain point? When a child doesn't match your expected path, why is there divergence? Why is there difference framed as a problem, a red flag, an observation checkpoint, a delay, a gap, a falling behind, a label of special educational needs that situates the problem within the child? This positions children in deficits rather than questioning whether the pathways itself is there, or the pathway itself is the right measure in the first place. And this model leaves little room for creativity, for innovation, for the idea that there are valid, equally valuable developmental pathways that don't follow neat linear sequences. It really prompts the bigger question: is it the child who needs to change, or is it the educational offer that needs to essentially be redeveloped, redesigned? When we challenge the universal lens, we recognize that diversity in development is not the exception, it is the rule. Once we embrace that we can design environments, expectations, and relationships that meet children where they are at, only then can we have an education system that really helps all of our children to thrive, essentially. And I think it's important to say at this point of the pathway session that you might be feeling that inevitable doom and gloom of there is just so much to do, or there are so many barriers and challenges, when we just want to turn up and care for, educate, and support children to thrive. So sometimes this feels heavy. And what I want to say is that diverse pathways for early childhood is one thing of many. There is so much advocacy happening out there already. There are so many initiatives. There are so many advocates. There is so much troublemaking to really uproot these systems that are not working. And for me, it feels that we've almost like got to go on a bear hunt. We've got to get through the SEND system to the other side to see these alternative approaches that are actually going to make a difference to our children and families' lives. The SEND system almost feels like a barrier to accessing the information that is going to go on to make a difference. And so often educators will feel that there isn't things happening beyond navigating the SEND system, or having to jump through hoops, or having to use practices and approaches that do not inherently feel right to them. The information is there, the advocacy is there. We've just got to look at a way to make it more accessible to early childhood, which itself is a sector that is often looked down upon and marginalized in its own experiences. So how do we get through it to see those alternative approaches? And that is where we challenge this universal lens and essentially the approach that we've chosen for developing diverse pathways for early childhood. So if we accept that a universal pathway isn't the only valid route, then we have to recognize what that means for children whose development looks different to what is expected. Children on divergent pathways are still learning, they're still playing, they're still sensing, they're still moving through their world, but they may be doing so in ways that don't match typical sequencing or timing. Now, when we talk about divergent and diverse pathways, we are not in any way saying to ignore or neglect those things that you are concerned about. You absolutely must have timely responses to that. But rather than always thinking that something is wrong or something is delayed, ask yourself, is this a difference rather than a delay? What are the strengths that I can use to build upon the areas of need that I've identified? When I am communicating my curiosities and concerns to a parent or carer, am I doing that in a way that does not pathologize or situate the problem within the child as though they are failing in their development because they have a difference or a delay? So it's not about ignoring things that you are worried about. We absolutely must respond to that. But if a child then goes on to have a diagnosis, or we recognize a lifelong developmental difference, it's making sure that how that child comes to understand themselves is not through a deficit lens, that they don't feel shame and mortification at being different, that they recognize, oh, I'm different, so I am autistic, or I have developmental language difference, or I have a stammer, and that's not viewed negatively. It's just recognized as part of their developmental profile. So divergent development is equally valid and meaningful, and the ways in which a child explores, engages, and makes sense of their world, it's not a deficiency. We need the tools, we need the resources to be able to make sense of those differences, and that is essentially what Diverse Pathways is aiming to do. So rather than picking up typical child development guidance and thinking, well, the child doesn't fit into this and therefore I don't know what to do, or therefore I need an intervention, we need to be able to pick things up. We need to be able to access tools and resources that actually tell us about all all these diverse and divergent pathways that children might be experiencing, which will make our roles as educators more meaningful. It will deepen our connections with children and families, and it will contribute to an increased quality of life and developmentally meaningful outcomes for our children. As I said in the previous slide, there is hope. And in listening to this pathway session, I think that it is important that we also confront that there are issues, there are things that we need to dismantle, to address. But hopefully, this session has given you that fire in your belly. It likely is already there to think, okay, what is it that I can do to contribute to these shifts then? And it isn't necessarily about changing the world overnight. It is a process that is going to take time, but it's recognizing that your micro activism, your everyday acts of resistance to the sense system, your shifts, the way that you reframe, the way that you think, the way that you talk about, the way that you document children's experiences, all those contribute to a much broader tapestry that is going to result in change within this system. And we want to make this project as accessible as possible. So there will be lots of opportunities to engage in lots of different ways. And we know that this is not individualistic work, it requires collective work. And so if you are interested, I'm going to talk to you now about some of the starting points for resisting neuronormativity and developmentalism, but also other ways that you can engage, including a sneak peek at a divergent pathway. The way to dismantle developmentalism is really to question things. I read a really interesting article this week and it used the term bewildering, and it stated that we should be bewildered by the things that we are expected to use in early childhood. So when you pick up a child development guidance that says this is the right or typical way to develop, that should bewilder us, because when we go into our early childhood practice, we are often then encountering children that do not fit into these descriptions. So the article that I read said that actually being bewildered is an important disposition. It's an important mindset to have in order to start challenging things. So, for example, if you are given an assessment guidance that suggests the way we understand a child's development is to score how special needs they are, that should bewilder us. That should make us question, is that the best, the most richest way of understanding what is happening for our children? So, the way we dismantle is we rethink and we reimagine child development, not just in early years, but across the lifespan. So, it's about reframing, and the diverse and divergent pathway will help you to do that. It's about rejecting dominant bodies of knowledge that are not humanizing. So I'm not saying reject all dominant bodies of knowledge, but recognizing that lots of the evidence and the research and the information that we rely on in early childhood, it only really is geared towards one type of child, and that is white, middle class, male, Eurocentric, able-bodied, non-disabled, and it's based on this very kind of like narrow view of a child. So if something comes along that you inherently think this does not reflect the diversity of the children that I'm caring for, that I'm educating, look at alternatives, look at more humanizing alternatives. Diversify to include differences, not just delays. So we have got more training coming up where we think about how the way you language about children's development really influences how you then practice in everyday experiences. So really thinking about, am I always just talking about red flags? Am I always just talking about delays and deficits? And if I changed and shifted that language, would that open up my capacity for understanding children's development? And then thinking about quality of life, not just outcomes. This has been a really important part of diverse pathways. And essentially, it is rooted in this recognition that we currently have an education system that is besotted with predefined, standardized outcomes for children, but it asks too little question about what the quality of life is on the ways to those outcomes. And a really obvious example for you, I went into an early childhood setting. They were able to say that an autistic child was able to give eye contact for up to 60 seconds. That child was visibly uncomfortable. That child was visibly distressed. That child was masking eye contact. So yes, you can tick it off on a support plan, but if in the process that child is experiencing adversity on the journey to that outcome, we have to question the outcome. So we need to really think about that connection between what is the quality of life, what is the journey onto that developmentally meaningful outcome. And that's just a few things. There are so many more things, and hopefully you will join along in the project to learn about those things. So if you have liked what you have heard during this training, there are further ways to engage. You can follow along at diversepathways.org, where we are sharing updates and future training opportunities. You can access the materials in October, and that will include guidance, training, the divergent pathways themselves, digital tools, further reading and resources. There's quite a lot of information that you can then work through over time. And then you can follow along on Instagram. So we have started using Instagram a little bit more to promote some of our ideas. So that is diverse_pathways_early years. And we will signpost to other neurodiversity affirming advocates as well, so that you're learning from different perspectives and multiple sources. So I think a really important thing to state is that whilst we are a collective, there are always limits in lived experience. There are also perspectives that we might not be fully representing, but we will always signpost to those who are in the best place to represent those experiences as well. Okay, so this is just a sneak peek overview. You can have a more detailed overview on the website. We have included a couple of draft examples of some developmental insights. And this is giving you a sneak peek of our autistic play patterns developmental insight. So we do not use the term milestones, because milestones implies a race with fastest being the bestest. And we know that that is not a reality of child development. So we talk about developmental insights. What developmental insights do you have about your autistic or otherwise neurodivergent children? We begun with play patterns because play is one of those areas for autistic children that is often targeted for intervention. So there's often this idea that autistic children do not know how to play, and play does not come naturally to them, and we need to use play-based interventions to correct and normalize. And given that play is an innate experience of all children, and all children have a capacity to play, we wanted to start there. So play patterns, the actual term play patterns, was inspired by the work of Dr. Carmel Khan, who is a researcher who has done amazing research, written some phenomenal articles and a great book, really looking at autistic play experiences. So we use that terminology because we have framed the description of play by looking at it as patterns. So we've looked, for example, at heightened schema and an interest in repetitive play as a pattern. We've looked at autistic children's sensory seeking for sensory highs and glimmers as a pattern. And essentially, the divergent pathway for autism is going to have 3 developmental insights. The first one being play patterns, the second being communication identities, and the third being regulation rhythms. So we're starting with 3. We are staggering the release so people have time to process and make sense and to give feedback on whether it's any good. And you will get access to not only the developmental insight for those 3 areas, but you get an overall guidance to the diverse pathways of development. You get digital tools. You get a specific guidance on the developmental insight. So you get a guidance on play patterns. There is also a parent and carer version that has been made more accessible, not because we are wanting to dilute that information, but for somebody that wants a quick read, or if somebody is new to neurodiversity affirming practice. And what we've also included is something called the unique developmental insights. One of the things that we are really, really keen to ensure does not happen is that people think that we are suggesting that this describes definitively all autistic play. It does not. It is a collation and gathering of research and anecdote and lived experience to describe potential patterns, but we know that there are infinite ways in which children develop, and so the unique developmental insights is an opportunity for you to think about what your knowledge contribution is. So you might observe a play pattern that doesn't even exist within this document because everybody is unique. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview. Hopefully it excites you, and we are really, really open to feedback on essentially whether it's any good. Is it going to make a difference to our early childhood sector? Following on from this training, you might be really interested to develop your practice further, or you might have somebody in mind that you think would really enjoy this topic. And so we do have some paid training opportunities coming up. So we have a pathway session on the 23rd of September, which is an introduction to neurodiversity affirming practice in early childhood. And that will be 6:30 till 8 p.m. on Zoom. You can book a place at diversepathways.org. We also have a session on the 14th of October, 6:30 till 8 p.m., which is Understanding Ableism in Early Childhood. We've talked today about neuronormativity, but it's really important to understand ableism, which is the favouring and privileging of typically developing minds and non-disabled bodies, and how this shows up in early childhood. The reason we are offering these two courses is they are foundational courses in understanding neurodiversity-affirming practice, but in my freelance role, these are two of my most requested courses. People are really interested in this topic. Again, you can sign up at diversepathways.org. You also get access to a free resource for taking part in this training, which is the Neurodiversity-affirming language deck. And it is essentially a deck of digital cards that you can use to develop your understanding of key terminologies in neurodiversity. This affirming deck will grow over time, but you get the starter pack. And you might want to share those with colleagues. You might want to go through them yourself, and they will hopefully help to expand and diversify your language around developmental differences and disabilities. You also have the option of accessing the references. So I've included a reference list in this training if you want to explore any of these topics further. And I have a book that was released in August 2025, Neurodiversity Affirming Practices in Early Childhood, which describes some of the work that I do independently, but also now part of the collective in early childhood. And it is a book that focuses on a guide to diverse development and play in early childhood spaces. And the final thing to say is please do keep in touch. Please do follow along. It would be great if you could complete the evaluation for this free pathway session so we can make sure that we are always improving. But it'll be really good to have you follow along on this adventure in diverse pathways for early childhood. Thank you so much for listening.